Hello, everyone. Welcome back, and welcome to any newcomers to the conclusion of our summer spaceflight history series. I'm Dr. Kevin Cooke, a postdoc at the Physics and Astronomy Department here at KU. And after working at the US Space and Rocket Center prior to grad school, I've had a passion for sharing the story of the politics and partnerships of the space race. And during today's episode, we're bringing everything that we learned over the past few weeks together. To review, after a long history as a long-range military weapon, rocketry began to be used in the 1950s for research purposes, as well as their traditional ICBM use, starting with the beginnings of the space race between the US and the USSR. This competition was to impress unaligned nations in the Cold War and took the form of races to the first satellite in orbit and the first person in orbit, both competitions that the US lost. However, seeking to redefine how this competition was progressing, after the success of sending the first astronaut into space as part of the Mercury program, President John F. Kennedy made his urgent needs speech to Congress and advocated for a human voyage to the moon by the end of the decade. After his assassination in 1963, the goal of reaching the moon instead became a promise to a fallen leader rather than a campaign tool or a tool of a present-day leader, even though Lyndon B. Johnson did use it quite significantly for the jobs involved. After this assassination was the Gemini program, where US astronauts learned to fly and work in space for long periods of time. And finally, this brings us to the lunar landings themselves in a program named Apollo. So while lunar landings were on the military's long-term planning list for later in the century, and these landing designs were made as early as the mid-1950s, they weren't seen as a clear and present need. And the Apollo program and the idea for a lunar landing was really taken up by the civilian NASA and undertaken under the name of Apollo, named by NASA manager Abe Silverstein because of the image of Apollo riding his chariot across the stars, feeling that it was appropriate for the grand scale of the missions that would be involved. Apollo was designed to bring 3 astronauts from the surface of the Earth to lunar orbit. And then following the lunar orbit rendezvous mode that we discussed last week, 2 of those astronauts would enter a landing vehicle and descend to the lunar surface, perform whatever work they needed to perform, ascend and reunite with the 3rd astronaut, and all 3 would come back home. And to accomplish such a tremendous feat, we needed an even more expansive craft in order to house the astronauts. Here I have a review of the different capsules that we've discussed over the past few weeks. The Mercury capsule was quite snug at about 1.7 cubic meters for its 1 crew member, but was really only designed for the preliminary flights of launching an astronaut into space for about a day and not much longer. The Gemini capsule was an upgrade in many, many ways, thanks to its maneuverability while in orbit. But it was only about 50% additional volume for 200% the astronaut. And it was that amount of space that was used for their 2-week-long missions to prove that the astronauts themselves could work and survive long enough in space for a lunar mission. The Apollo capsule would be downright spacious in comparison at 6 cubic meters for 3 crew members, and again for 2 weeks, the maximum amount of time for any of these lunar missions to take off from the Earth, go to the moon, and then come back. Now, the Apollo command module went through many design phases. One of the most important changes that happened was that the first generation of command modules, which would house the astronauts for their flight to the moon, and you can see one of the chairs here that they would use during takeoff, was originally designed when direct ascent was the primary mission mode, when it was one giant vehicle ascending from the Earth and also landing and ascending from the moon. And so the Block 1, as these were known, capsules, were missing important features such as the airlock in front needed to connect with the lunar lander, as well as other electronics that were needed for the rendezvous with it. However, these old Block 1s could still be used for tests in low Earth orbit, even if they weren't using the lunar lander. The astronauts really did not like this strategy. They felt that the Block 1 was already problematic enough, thanks to flammable materials being kept in it, as well as inconvenient tool placement. And it didn't necessarily reflect what they would be flying to the moon. So they felt that they were wasting time getting acclimated to a craft they wouldn't even use. And this command module that you can see here would be placed on top of a service module underneath, which would house all the important features that you would need to keep power and engines going on your trip to the moon. This is where your fuel tanks and oxygen tanks and fuel cells would be stored. The service module was split into 6 sectors, much like wedges in a pie. And some of them were purposefully kept empty for the purpose of customizing individual missions to the moon, enabling the astronauts to bring experiments to lunar orbit on their way there. And then the top of this combined stack would feature a launch escape system to bring the astronauts away from the pad if any emergencies were ever needed. But otherwise, this feature that you can see on the left was disposed of during ascent. And this design here, you can tell it's for the Block 2 capsule because there is a docking mechanism right here at the top. And this would enable astronauts to travel to and from the lunar lander. Formerly called the Lunar Excursion Module at first, or the LEM, the name was then changed to just Lunar Module because they felt that excursion was too fanciful for a name for the vehicle. It also went through many redesigns during its history. Here you can see just the changes that happened over the course of 3 years. This was built by Grumman Aircraft, a different manufacturer from the command module, and which was North American Aviation. And you can see that this capsule had 2 components. There was the descent stage at the bottom. This would include the engine needed to slow the craft down from lunar orbit and bring it down to the surface of the moon. The top module would be where the astronauts would live. And this was also the ascent module. Once the astronauts were done with their work, there would be an engine underneath this top module that would use the bottom as a launch pad, and then only this top component would bring the astronauts back up into lunar orbit. To bring this combined stack into space, we needed heavy lifting rockets in order to do so. The rockets that we had talked about in previous weeks just couldn't do the job. And so we turned to the Saturn series. The Saturn I first flew in 1961, so actually still had quite a heritage by the time that the final designs for the lunar lander were coming about. The Saturn series is very notable because this was the first rocket series to be designed for cargo carrying capacity rather than as an ICBM. So the first rocket line to be developed and flown without the express design for warfare. The Saturn I could bring 20,000 pounds into Earth orbit. You can see that the first stage is fairly unique in that it's a cluster of tanks that would then support 8 Rocketdyne H1 engines on the bottom. The Saturn I would then be upgraded to more than double its cargo carrying capacity, and this would be the Saturn 1B, which could bring 46,000 pounds into Earth orbit, which would be enough to bring the command module and service module, which you can see in the gray here at the top, as well as the lunar module up into space, at least for testing in Earth orbit. And for those of you that may not be familiar with how these launches worked, the craft that we discussed would all be stacked on top of each other. The command module and service module would be connected as they would be throughout the vast majority of flight, but the lunar module would be stored underneath it. And then once the stack was launched into space, the command module would turn around to dock with the lunar module and extricate it from the final Saturn stage. This is a maneuver called transposition and docking. Now, this entire system was only good enough to bring this stack into Earth orbit. It wasn't enough to bring this payload all the way to the moon. To do that, we needed further upgrades to our lifting capacity, and that was the Saturn V rocket. You can see for scale where that capsule and lunar module are on the Saturn V. The second and third stages would use the then fairly new experimental liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen for greater efficiency while in the vacuum of space. And then the first stage would use a combination of RP1, the special rocketry form of kerosene, and liquid oxygen for its raw power to get out of the thickest parts of the atmosphere. And these two fuel sources would be burned through 5 F1 engines, the most powerful rocket engines ever to have flown. You can see designer Wernher von Braun from the Huntsville Arsenal next to these engines for scale. They are absolutely massive, and each one had the same amount of thrust as the entire first stage of a Saturn 1B. And it was during the testing of these craft, prepping to send the first Apollo astronauts into space for testing, that tragedy struck NASA.
Special report. This is Mike Wallace at the CBS Newsroom in New York. America's first 3 Apollo astronauts were trapped and killed by a flash fire that swept their moonship early tonight during a launch pad test at Cape Kennedy in Florida. Virgil Gus Grissom, 40 years old, one of the original Mercury astronauts, the first American astronaut to go twice into space. Edward White, 36 years old, the first American to walk in space. And rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee, 31 years old, training for his first space flight, Apollo 1, scheduled for February 21st. These 3 astronauts were aboard their spaceship 10 minutes from a simulated liftoff at Cape Kennedy when the fire hit at about 6:30 tonight. They were inside their spaceship, pressurized, buttoned up inside their spacesuits when the fire hit. A closed-circuit television camera was relaying pictures of the astronauts lying on their backs inside the spacecraft atop the 2-stage Saturn I. There was a flash, and that was it, according to a NASA spokesman watching the television screen in the blockhouse a few hundred yards away from Launch Pad 34.
What was called the Apollo 1 fire was a tremendous blow to the lives of all of the astronauts in NASA. All of the astronauts had been incredibly close, and to lose heroes, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee in not spaceflight and the exploration that had been their goal, but during a test, was gut-wrenching for everyone. What had happened was that during this test, a simulated takeoff in which the rocket wouldn't actually fly, the astronauts were fully suited up and sealed within an Apollo Block 1 capsule. The atmosphere had been pressurized to 16 pounds per square inch to mimic the pressure differential that the capsule would feel while in space. And this atmosphere was 100% pure oxygen. Normally during a flight, the capsule is this super pressurized during launch in order to keep this pressure differential constant during ascent. The atmosphere is slowly bled out of the capsule down to 5 pounds per square inch while in vacuum, so that the capsule experiences effectively the same pressure throughout the entire flight. And it was known that at 5 pounds per square inch, a pure oxygen environment, any fires in that environment could be controllable by the crew. But while on the ground during that super pressurized 16 pounds per square inch, the atmosphere flash fired due to an errant spark from wiring in the capsule, immediately consuming the oxygen. And the astronauts who, while in suits, their life support systems were partially burnt through, and they asphyxiated due to carbon monoxide poisoning. This created a tremendous amount of change in how the Apollo Block 1 and Block 2 capsules were treated. And there were some prophetic words by Gus Grissom mere months before the fire. If we die, we want people to accept it. We are in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life. Apollo hardware would be grounded for an entire year as changes were made, such as the atmosphere at the 16 pounds per square inch level being a mix of nitrogen and oxygen before switching to a pure oxygen mix at 5 pounds per square inch, as well as significant limits on flammable materials within the capsule. And you can see on these astronauts' flight suits, there is a patch for their flight that didn't fly, Apollo 1. And their wives requested that this name, Apollo 1, be reserved for them in memoriam. And NASA agreed. And so Apollo 1 is a monument to making sure that as many safety methods are taken to preserve the lives of astronauts as possible. It was during this reorganization of the Apollo program that some test flights were renamed Apollo 2 and 3. These were uncrewed test flights. But with the year-long grounding of Apollo hardware, there was a significant desire to get back up into space, even if it was uncrewed test flights, making sure that everything was safe enough again. And in order to meet the end of the decade deadline set by the late President Kennedy, the entire test schedule was changed, and they would have to start testing up again with a full stack test of a Saturn V. This would be the first time a Saturn V would fly. And instead of the F1 engines being tested in an incremental flight prior to a full orbital flight, everything would be tested at once. The Saturn V is an absolute behemoth at 363 feet tall. You can see for perspective, here is launch control. As a building next to it. Those smudges are cars, and the pixels you see at the bottom of the image are people. For further perspective on how magnificent these machines are, here is the scale models of the rockets that were used as part of the space program. We can see the rockets that we discussed in our first few weeks, the V2 missile, the Mercury Redstone that brought Alan Shepard into suborbital flight. It has the red top. Also with the red top here is a Mercury Atlas, which brought John Glenn into orbit. The Gemini missions use the Titan II, which isn't seen here, but is only a few feet taller than Mercury Atlas. And then the Saturn V is so large, it needed a cutout in Wernher von Braun's office ceiling in order to house it proportionally with everything else. And so a year after the Apollo 1 fire, NASA gave the go-ahead for the first test flight of Apollo hardware as part of Apollo 4 on November 9th, 1967. The people that you will hear are Jack King from NASA giving the play-by-play of the rocket's launch. And then there is color commentary by Walter Cronkite of CBS News.
Repeat, the ignition sequence will start at 8.9 seconds. We'll be looking to liftoff at 0. T-minus 30 seconds and counting. We'll count down from starting at T-minus 20. T-minus 25. Stage is reporting ready for launch. T-minus 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 5, 4, we have ignition. All engines are running. We have liftoff. We have liftoff at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The tower has...
My God, our building's shaking here. Our building's shaking.
That rustling is the glass windows shaking in the press room.
The roar is terrific. The building's shaking. This big glass window is shaking. We're holding it with our hands. Look at that rocket go into the clouds at 3,000 feet. The roar is terrific.
This was a tremendous success. While the F1 engines had been tested on the ground, this was really the first time that they were able to stretch their legs, lifting what they were designed to lift. And there's an old joke that when those F1 engines light, it's not the rocket that lifts off, but it's Florida that sinks. Additionally, according to Industry Week at least, there were small earthquakes as high as 4.6 on the Richter scale registered across North America when Apollo 4 launched from Florida in 1967. This was an unaccrued flight that basically put the new upgraded command module into a high orbit. There was an automated camera that took pictures and returned sites like this, which, while didn't have enough resolution for scientific use, represented the hope of getting Apollo back on track and meeting President Kennedy's deadline. Now, while the Saturn V had proved to actually work, after so much work in designing something that was such a leap ahead, there were still some problem children in the program, such as the lunar lander. The specifications for the lunar lander were extremely tight, and so it had meant significant delays throughout its design period. And in order to test its engines, a short flight into Earth orbit, uncrewed again, was flown by Saturn 1B. This would be a lunar lander without the legs, effectively a test just making sure that its engines worked while in the vacuum of space. Following up this would be a second test flight of Saturn V. This was Apollo 6, and it was originally designed to be an automated lunar flyby of the upgraded command module. However, oscillations that occurred during flight damaged some of the J2 engines on the second and third stages, preventing them from relighting while in Earth orbit to send the capsule to the moon. And so effectively, Apollo 6 repeated Apollo 4's flight path. And this proved that, okay, the Saturn V did have some kinks to work out, and the engineers would be kept busy trying to make sure that this beast would be ready for human travelers when the time came. And the time would come for the Saturn 1B at least, as the first human test flight for Apollo after Apollo 1 was slated for October 11th, 1968. This would be Apollo 7, 22 months after the conclusion of the Gemini program. And you can see that the pressure is really building in terms of the amount of time left in the decade for us to bring astronauts to the moon. This would be a mission led by veteran astronaut Wally Schirra on a 10-day mission into just Earth orbit to prove that humans approved of the new Block 2 Apollo capsule while in orbit. Unfortunately, this mission was strife with a lot of difficulties. There was a tug of war in authority between the astronauts and flight control as to whether to launch during high winds. This set up a very contentious work relationship that was exacerbated by motion sickness and head colds, which in a pressurized capsule for 10 days just made the head colds worse over time. This made the astronauts want to keep their helmets off during re-entry and landing, which was another tug of war between the crew and mission control. And this is pretty well summed up during the statements made by Wally Schirra and Capcom, the capsule communicator, down in mission control. Schirra saying, "We tried on the helmets this morning. We really don't want to wear them during landing because we feel that the pain will impair our performance from the pressure in our sinuses." Capcom said, "We understand that. We are only concerned about the landing, and the shock of landing in the ocean may create whiplash and damage your necks and head. We couldn't care less about reentry, but it's your neck and I hope you don't break it." And Schirra curtly responded, "Thank you, babe." Fortunately, there were no injuries returning these astronauts to the ground, but this really set up a dynamic that needed to be addressed by making sure that the astronauts in mission control knew exactly what amount of tests would be required during the flight. Apollo 7 was rife with mission control just sending them additional tests or TV broadcasts to do on top of everything else. And this wasn't the only contentious sphere in the country, as this was 1968 and the presidential election had swung back around again. And incumbent Lyndon B. Johnson was not up for re-election. He had withdrawn privately due to concerns about his health and publicly due to poor polling early in the election cycle. And so when election came around, The former rival of JFK, Richard M. Nixon, and former vice president of Dwight Eisenhower, won, just eking out the popular vote by about 500,000 popular votes, but in an electoral landslide. The Democrats had fairly fallen apart during the 1960s as the old New Deal alliances between Northern and Southern Democrats came to a head during the Civil Rights Movement, and Southern Democrats broke away, with George Wallace of Alabama leading a white supremacist pro-segregation ticket, which won over 9 million popular votes, and truly broke the old style of democratic alliances that had existed prior in the century, and setting up many of the new alliances that we see today. And many were wondering what is going to happen with the space program now that we have a new president. It takes several years for new Congresses and new presidents to exert influence on budgets. So as far as now, the first few Apollo missions, at least, would be safe to conclude. And many still felt that it was in the interest of the nation to complete this program, since we had set off to the moon as a promise to both the fallen president and to the world. Following the election was NASA's most ambitious test flight yet. This was Apollo 8, not originally designed to fly around the moon, but tasked with it because of the looming deadline of 1970 soon coming up. And so Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders were given a quick 6-day mission to fly around the moon and back to land on the Earth, but not land on the moon. During their flight, they had the most watched TV broadcast to that date, a Christmas Eve reading of the Book of Genesis, which won a special Emmy. And during their flight around the moon, they found something magnificent. While pictures like this were expected, this Earthrise photo, or the discovery of Earth, became an instant hit, being a symbol of the environmental movement that swept through the 1960s and 70s. And the crew, for bringing such a symbol of unity back, were honored by many people and recognized as Men of the Year by Time magazine. Frank Borman once said that he had received a letter after the mission saying, "You saved 1968. Not only was there an incredibly divisive election, but there were the assassinations of JFK's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So 1968 was a tremendously stressful and divisive year in America, and Apollo 8 represented one of those hopes of what we can do in the name of peace. Following the success of Apollo 8 was a quick test flight of Apollo 9. This was to test the lunar module in the relative safety of Earth orbit. So James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweickart went up in the command module, but McDivitt and Schweickart would then crawl through the tube connecting the two craft, fly the lunar module for some maneuvers in Earth orbit, and then re-dock with the command module to head back home. This is a very noteworthy test flight because this was the first time that humans flew a craft in space that could not safely re-enter Earth's atmosphere. But fortunately, everything went as planned. Following this was the final test flight prior to the landings of Apollo 10, a full dress rehearsal set up with all veteran astronauts Gene Cernan, John Young, and Tom Stafford, who had cut their teeth as part of the Gemini program. They would fly to the moon, enter into lunar orbit. Stafford and Cernan would enter into the lunar module and fly to within 8 nautical miles of the lunar surface before having to reunite with John Young in the command module in lunar orbit. And with this successful dress rehearsal, all that was left was terminal descent and landing. And this would be the task for Apollo 11. This would be a monumental mission, the first attempt at a lunar landing. And so the mission patch was designed with many things in mind. First would be recognition of all the people who had worked hard to make this mission a reality. And so the astronauts decided to waive their names from the patch, saying that it wouldn't be fair because there were millions of people in total who had contributed to this mission and there wasn't enough space for everyone. Additionally, the Apollo 11 name would use Arabic numerals for the number 11 instead of Roman numerals, which had been used on many previous flights, as an accessibility point because more people around the world were familiar with Arabic numerals rather than Roman numerals. Finally, not only was America included in the picture through the bald eagle, but the entire world was included as the Earth. And as a symbol of peace, the eagle would be holding an olive branch as a symbol of peace. Originally, the patch had those talons open until it was corrected because that could be seen as an aggressive gesture. And so on this mission of peace, 3 heroic astronauts were chosen. Michael Collins from Gemini 10, Buzz Aldrin from Gemini 12, and Neil Armstrong from Gemini 8 would be tasked with flying to the moon, with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong being tasked with the landing itself. The crew got up at around 4 a.m. on July 16th, 1969, and began preparing for their 9:32 a.m. flight. The crew had a pre-flight breakfast consisting of steak, eggs, and a side of toast, with a choice of orange juice and coffee. With the conclusion of their breakfast and getting suited up for their flight, they boarded their command module titled Columbia on their Saturn V and prepared for launch. This would be a launch set for 9:32 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 16th, 1969.
20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading. Plus 30 seconds. Roll complete and pitches program.
And you could hear Armstrong just then saying that the roll and pitch maneuvers to set Apollo 11 on course were successful. And with this successful launch, the crew were able to ascend into Earth orbit and relight the third stage engine to send them on a trajectory to the moon. This would be a 3-day trip entering lunar orbit on July the 19th. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin left the command module, Columbia, and sealed themselves in the lunar module called Eagle to descend into a landing site in the Sea of Tranquility on the moon. This was a somewhat fraught landing as there were overflows in the landing computer, thanks to Aldrin keeping the rendezvous radar and landing radars on at the same time. This was a safety method from his perspective in case they needed to abort. But fortunately, they were able to power through those computer difficulties and set themselves up for landing. However, Armstrong noticed that the original landing site that was chosen had quite a few boulders, and he would need to customize a landing site nearby. Here, I'm going to play a video of that landing. The countdown for a bingo call is the time at which the crew needs to abort the landing and ascend back up to Columbia with Collins in lunar orbit, because otherwise they wouldn't have enough fuel if they spent it landing on the moon afterwards.
40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 20, down a half. 30 seconds forward. Just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. APA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Armstrong's call out of Tranquility Base was actually an ad-lib. They were supposed to refer to the module as Eagle, but everyone liked the new name, and so Tranquility Base it was. And so with the first words spoken on the moon, contact light, Aldrin and Armstrong had landed on the moon at about 3:17 p.m. West Lawrence, Kansas time. And then 6 hours later, they were set up for their spacewalk or moonwalk, in which Armstrong would first set foot on the moon. This would be much later in the day at about 9:56 p.m. Kansas time. But nevertheless, it was watched by over 650 million viewers, over 53 million households across the world. So Armstrong is now standing at the bottom of the landing module's landing legs, where there are these pads that are depressed into the lunar surface. He is standing on that pad and will now step onto the lunar soil itself.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And so with that statement, one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind, Armstrong became the first human being to set foot on another celestial body. After taking a contingency sample to make sure they had something to bring back no matter what happened, and a final call on whether to stay or leave, they found that everything was good to go. They were safe to stay. And 20 minutes later, Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface. During their 2.5-hour extravehicular activity outside of the Eagle, they set up a series of passive experiments, such as a passive seismic experiment package used to measure moonquakes, as well as a retroreflector array, which you can see here, which would enable scientists to point laser beams at the landing site, and the laser would be bounced immediately back towards the Earth for scientific purposes. Now, they were able to fill up 2 sample boxes with about 47 pounds or 21 kilograms of samples from the lunar surface. And these samples included 3 new minerals that had not been observed on Earth. And these were named armalcolite, tranquilityite, and pyroxferite. Armalcolite is actually named after the combined names of Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. And all have been subsequently found on Earth. Now that people know what to look for. Following their successful experiments and spacewalks, 21 hours after they had landed on the moon's surface, Armstrong and Aldrin ascended with the ascent stage of Eagle to join Collins in lunar orbit. And here is a phenomenal picture showing those 2 astronauts and the rest of the human race, both past, present, and future, in one frame, with Collins behind the camera on one side. All 3 astronauts successfully returned to Earth safely, meeting John F. Kennedy's promise to put a person on the moon and return them safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. All 3 astronauts would become international celebrities, starting a 37-day goodwill tour around the world, from countries across all continents, I believe, except Antarctica. And they were seen by some over 100 million people. Now, following the conclusion of Apollo 11, the future Apollo flights could take on a slower pace, because the time deadline had now been met. And so future missions could take on a more scientific focus. Apollo 12 would send Pete Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean to the moon, with Pete Conrad and Al Bean on the surface. Apollo 12 is noteworthy because during ascent, their command module had been struck by lightning, requiring them to switch power supply units mid-flight. And I joke that Apollo 12 is like Apollo 11, but with twice the work. Because instead of just a 2.5-hour EVA, this was effectively a 4-hour EVA, again, putting experiment packages on the surface and requiring them to meet up with the Surveyor 3 probe, which had been a lander sent several years prior, becoming the first time that human beings had gone out into space to reunite with one of our automated probes. This was also kind of a funny mission, as the surface experiment package required a plutonium fuel element that was tough to install into the experiment package, requiring them to use a hammer to hammer it into place. But fortunately, everything worked out safely, and all of the astronauts were able to return to the Earth. However, they returned to some somber news, as the following year, future Apollo missions were canceled. Apollos 15 through 19 were canceled by President Nixon, and NASA reorganized their objectives into an approved mission profile of 15 through 17. Now, there was a limit of 15 Saturn V launch vehicles. Apollo 20 was also canceled, and its launch vehicle reserved for something called an orbital workshop, which would evolve to become America's first space station. And the other Saturn V vehicles would be saved for museums. But NASA would still have enough funding and Saturn V's to perform Apollos 13 through 17 before the conclusion of the program. And it was on the heels of this setback that we had the Apollo 13 near disaster. Jim Lovell and Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes were all sent to lunar orbit to explore the Frau-Mora Highlands. However, a disaster struck midway through the flight. During a routine stir of the liquid oxygen tanks to prevent liquid oxygen from settling, that tank exploded out of the side of the service module, severely crippling Odyssey's ability to power itself, and thus the astronauts needed to use the lunar module as a lifeboat. Now, there were many plans to bring the astronauts back. There were several abort modes, which would be critical returns, bringing the astronauts back without flying all the way around the moon. However, these required the performance of the service module's engine, which was not confidently considered at the time because the damage was so close to that engine. And to give additional perspective, because this is not a to-scale image of where the disaster happened, on this to-scale plot, the Apollo 13 astronauts had a successful flight up until this point where the cryogenic oxygen tank had exploded. And so they were tasked with a free return trajectory flying by the moon on a fast trajectory to return them to the Earth. Fortunately, this worked, and the lunar module kept them safe, although not very comfortable, for their return trip. And once they disconnected from the service module in preparation for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, they saw the extent of the damage to Odyssey's service module, and it was a very good thing that they did not try and relight that service module's engine. All three astronauts were safely recovered and treated as heroes. Jim Lovell retired from NASA thereafter. Jack Swigert actually ran for Congress but died before he could take office. And Fred Hayes would work in the early days of Nixon's new sustainable space program, which would be announced shortly thereafter, which we'll talk about on a future slide. So why did this explosion happen? Well, the oxygen tank had been dropped 2 inches during construction, although North American Aviation maintains that it had tested the performance of the tank and found it to be okay. And what this meant was that it was difficult to fully drain. And so during a countdown demonstration test, frozen oxygen built up in the tank, and heaters were used to warm the liquid oxygen enough to unfreeze. And an electricity surge at that same time fused some of the wiring and the heating elements, such that when the tank was stirred during flight, the tank exploded. Future tanks would have different heating element designs to avoid such an issue. The return to flight for Apollo would be Apollo 14 on January 31st, 1971, commanded by the first American in space, Alan Shepard. And this would be a scientific mission placing seismometers and mortars to measure the internal structure of the moon, which would be handled after the astronauts ascended from the lunar surface. But because of all the tools that they had brought, Alan Shepard was also able to bring a set of golf balls and a customized driver to fit on the end of the multi-purpose tools that they would be using on the surface, becoming the first golfer on the moon. They would also enjoy the use of the modular equipment transporter, effectively this two-wheeled wheelbarrow, to enable them to bring experiments across the surface, as well as bringing lunar samples from a greater distance. It was during this time that the missions took on a much greater scientific focus, with astronauts being trained in field geology here on the ground before being sent to the moon. Alan Shepard didn't particularly like this, but the crew of the next mission, Apollo 15, took to it much more readily, thanks to the teachings of Caltech geologist Lee Silver and a Apollo astronaut candidate, Harrison Schmitt, who had a geology background. And so they would undergo these field trainings once a month prior to their launch. And once the astronauts launched on Apollo 15, they would be tasked with actually performing field tests as geologists would. And you can see James Irwin here in this photo. He would be accompanied by David Scott and another companion, which would be new for this mission. And you can see this new companion in the right hand of the slide. The lunar rover now joined them on these missions. The lunar rover enabled them to cover 17 miles for geology excursions, over 18.5 hours of extravehicular activities and moonwalks to collect samples across the Hadley Rill. Now, it wasn't just the surface-bound astronauts getting in on the science game. Al Worden in the Apollo 15 command module was tasked with releasing small miniature satellites from the service module, which would then measure the gravitational and magnetic fields of the moon. Now, I had mentioned that Nixon was pursuing a more sustainable space program. And so on January 5th, 1972, that next generation was announced. NASA Administrator James Fletcher and President Nixon discussed this new space transportation system, aka a space shuttle, which was designed to have a vehicle that could be flown and re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and reflown up to 100 times, with the goal of bringing both men and women into space on a much cheaper basis than the Apollo missions could do. But this system was still a decade down the line. And we still had the final few Apollo missions to conclude. There was Apollo 16, which was John Young, Thomas Mattingly, and Charlie Duke. It was a 3-day-long mission on the lunar surface, and they were able to recover the largest lunar sample near Flag Crater, titled Big Muley for one of their program managers, at 26 pounds. Now, John Young wasn't just collecting lunar samples. You can see a tool behind him in the shadow of the lunar module, and that is actually a telescope. It is the Far Ultraviolet Camera and Spectroscope. It was the first telescope to make astronomical observations from the surface of another celestial body. This was designed by Dr. George Carruthers of the Naval Research Laboratory and could take spectra from about 300 to 1300 angstroms and UV images in 2 different pass bands at around 1,000 to 1,200 angstroms, and 1,200 to 1,500 angstroms. And you can see an image of the Earth taken in the ultraviolet here, which is capturing the recombination of ionized oxygen with free electrons. And that recombination of oxygen is shining in the ultraviolet. Finally, the last Apollo mission of Apollo 17 would include the first scientist on the moon. Harrison Schmitt, that geologist I mentioned, had originally worked at the US Geological Survey's Astrogeology Center at Flagstaff, Arizona, and then following his qualifications with jet propulsion, would then qualify to join the Apollo crews. And during this geology mission with Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt on the surface, they would recover some strange orange minerals on the surface of the moon. And this made everyone very excited, as these orange volcanic rocks were expected to be due to recent volcanic activity. And so people were shocked. They thought that, oh, this must mean that the moon is much more active than we thought. But it turned out that when the samples were dated, they were 3.6 billion years old and only unveiled by the creation of Shorty Crater 17 million years ago. And with the conclusion of Apollo 17, we left behind the plaque, "Here man completed his first explorations of the moon, December 1972 AD. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind." The crew of Apollo 17 took off from the surface of the moon on December 14th, returning to Earth on December 19th, bringing the Apollo lunar landings to a close. Pursuing a dream to utilize space for national interest and world peace, President Eisenhower formed the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1958. After launching its first few satellites, its first large test was the attempt to beat the Soviets in launching a human being into orbit. We failed. But the Mercury 7 and their flights opened the heavens to America and proved we had the ability to participate in the new age of space. Following these successes, President Kennedy promised that we could go to the moon and return safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. After his assassination, this promise to a fallen leader inspired us to perform daring, complex tasks in space as part of the Gemini program, which turned the tide of the space race, with America paving the way in the most complex rendezvous and docking maneuvers to date, proving that we had the knowledge of flight to go to the moon. And finally, putting it all together and living up to Kennedy's promise to the American people and to the world, the Apollo program successfully landed 12 astronauts on the near side of the moon, with the astronauts bringing back a collected 2,200 samples of material weighing over 840 pounds or 381 kilograms. These would be processed into more than 100,000 samples shared with the nations across the world to bring this piece of heavens back down to Earth. This would be the farthest, highest, and fastest that humanity has explored to date, and I'm so happy to have shared this all with you today. Thank you so much for joining us for the series. And of course, if you would like to know more, here's a selection of books that these stories were taken from. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and I'll see you out there.